everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Weekly. Joe and Kyle here. Really excited to dig into some news. How you doing today, Kyle?
Pretty good, Joe. How are you doing?
Pretty good. I just got the all clear on my arm break. I can do all sorts of physical therapy now.
Nice.
Yeah. Apparently the bone healed well, so I didn't screw it up as
So
I thought I had.
you can get back on the mountain soon?
Maybe.
No,
Maybe.
not that soon.
Maybe. Yeah, it's complex. We'll see. But yeah, I'm on the mend. It's good. My concussion seems to be repairing well. So back at it, I hope. Yeah, and I guess let's chat a little bit about what we've got going on. So we are full steam ahead on Vital, which is really great. I'm excited about that. Can you give us a little bit of a clue on where we stand with Vital right now?
Yeah, so our applications are still open. We've just extended the application window. It was originally for March 19th. We just extended that for an extra week or so. So if you haven't filled out an application, definitely do that before we close that off completely. Yeah, we're kicking off Vital on April 17th, and then our classes will start on April 18th. So the 17th is an intro call, kind of going over all logistics of the program, and then we'll be kicking off class on the 18th of. So that'll be Tuesday. So we'll run every Tuesday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern time, and then you'll break off into your smaller little homerooms throughout the week. So those will be at different times. So if you're interested in getting a comprehensive foundation of psychedelic harm reduction, integration, and really trying to incorporate those practices, techniques into your practice or in your community, definitely check it out. vitalpsychedelictraining.com.
Right on. Thanks for that. I'm super excited for this round. Like, the reviews on the last round have been extraordinary. So great work, and excited to see what we can pull off this next year. It's going to be fun. So today on the show, we're going to run through a bunch of news, add some commentary, hopefully fill out the picture a little bit on what's going on. And yeah, hopefully it's worthwhile for you. Yeah. So Kyle, which one do we want to jump into first?
Let's see. Let's jump into some recent news around Field Trip Health. So there was just a headline that just came out that they will be closing up 5 of their clinics. So yeah, that was some really big news that hit, and I think right after the whole synthesis news too. I'm wondering like how everybody's feeling in the community. I'm sure it's like making people pretty on edge a little bit around like the state of the psychedelic business. So it sounds like they had some kind of financial issues with spend. So to kind of sum up some of these articles, so Field Trip posted a net revenue of $1.6 million for the quarter, up to 23% over the year, though the company's operating expenses totaled out to $8.1 million. Wow. So yeah, doing a lot of spend there. And then the net loss for the quarter was $6.9 million, but there was an improvement from the $8.8 million in the same period the prior year. So earnings per share were at a 0.8 loss, and an improvement for the 18 cent loss per share the year before. So yeah, it sounds like they'll be kind of closing up their clinics, and I'm kind of curious on what that means for the larger organization as a whole. And I also wonder, is this also kind of part of what happened with the reestablishing the Ryan Haight Act, which might be kind of hitting some ketamine clinics, and maybe they're doing a little bit of restructuring based around that act. So that act was kind of removed during the public health emergency during COVID, which allowed prescribers to prescribe medications via telehealth. And now that we're coming out of that, it seems like the Biden administration is going to be kind of putting that act back. But it sounds like with some like exemptions, and it sounds like providers will need to at least do one consultation in person. It sounds like people will be able to, if they already have that prescription, maybe continue checkups. after they've been in person. So, I mean, that's really kind of hitting some of these ketamine business models, right? That, if you go to a place like Mind Bloom, you're getting everything telehealth delivered. So people that didn't have physical locations, that might hurt them. But Field Trip does have physical locations. So I also wonder, is that really going to hurt them, right? I don't know how much telehealth they were actually doing there.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions, and it would be good to catch up on this so the rest of the field can learn, right? What what we're learning is that the psychedelic industry generally, needs to follow the same kind of business rules that everybody needs to follow, right? You need you can act like a startup, and really just kind of spend everything you get and accrue radical amounts of debt. I'm not saying this is what happened with Field Trip, but I know they were spending a lot and not making that much. So it's tough. Business fundamentals are real. You still have to pay people, and if you keep your expenses in check and just keep trying to drive business, that could be healthy, right? But I want to say too, they're kind of a victim of timing as well, right? A lot of their really beautiful clinics opened up right at the beginning of the pandemic and immediately weren't able to operate, build revenue and customers and stuff. I think they had some things going, but it's really, really tragic timing, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great point. I can't imagine starting an in-person clinic as the pandemic was hitting and then being like, what do you do, right? And then, we also have to talk about accessibility with ketamine treatments, right? Very inaccessible for a lot of folks to get that treatment. It is pretty expensive. So, I think this is something, just as the psychedelic field grows and we think about delivering these types of therapies to people, how to make it more accessible. I mean, these are pretty resource intensive protocols, right? So I mean, ketamine is 2 hours typically, right, for a lot of treatments. So just thinking about paying a therapist to sit with you for 2 hours and then doing all that stuff. So this is something that I think is an issue with the field, and it's out of a lot of people's reach for accessibility. Trying to pay for that treatment is difficult until insurance can really start to pick it up.
Right. And we've got a little bit of time there. So yeah, it's all speculation, right, on if the Ryan Haight Act was the real thing, or we've been seeing money becoming harder to get for businesses. The investment landscape is getting a lot harder. Cannabis is really, really feeling it, but we're seeing it on the regular stock exchange too. And, I think a classic indicator, Kyle, is economies people are freaking out a little bit. All of a sudden Bitcoin's up to 25,000 of Bitcoin, from 18 a couple of weeks ago. And when people freak out about the economy, it seems like that stuff spikes. So there seems to be some stuff tracking there.
Also makes me wonder about the bank collapsing, Silicon Valley Bank, and people maybe putting their money in Bitcoin after something like that, right?
Right. People are freaking out for sure about all this stuff. It's tough. I don't feel great. I don't love that people lost their jobs. I don't love that. No. It's another example of a business having a lot of problems in the space. What I hope in terms of good from this is people will really put focused attention on, their projects. We don't want to see more failures here in the psychedelic space. And we do know the Field Trip was doing a lot. Right, they had their own drug discovery thing. They were, expanding like crazy in terms of physical infrastructure. I do know they've retained their Toronto clinic. I'm sure there's some other clinics maybe that they're retaining. So here's to hoping, guys. I hope Field Trip's able to pull it off and recover a little bit here.
Yeah, it sounds like their clinics that they will be closing will stay open until April 15th on their news that they posted, and those clinics will be Chicago, Washington, Seattle, San Diego, and Fredericton. So it sounds like those are the 5 that will be closing up. So, you know, they'll probably still be operating and delivering their therapy in some of the other clinics that they have operating. So
yeah, right on. Cool. So I kind of want, I know you and David chatted about this a little bit, but there's a new article that came out the other day. Synthesis. Another, you know, like we're kind of seeing just stuff racking up, and it's a little, I'm sure it's more than a little concerning for a lot of people that want to be in this space full time, right? What was the title of this article? It was kind of goofy. So ecstaticintegration.substack.com. And the title was Synthesis in the Shadow of Psychedelic Capitalism. So it was an interesting enough read. Did you get this one?
Yeah, this was published by Jules Evans, and I did think it gave a nice kind of like historical overview around what was going on with synthesis, and then provided some more details from employees and kind of like some maybe inside type of information as well from internal. And it sounded like, you know, there's a lot of kind of different riffs that were going on, and it just really kind of like talked about more of the challenges as a business. But, you know, I think they did a good job there at the end, just talking about like, you know, it's easy to critique from the sidelines and never being a business owner and not knowing what it's like to do a startup, and the fact that most startups fail, and just that, you know, Synthesis has the founders and the you know, of Synthesis, like, you know, and the whole team like had the courage to sit there and tackle this. And provide retreats and training in the space. And, you know, it's also a huge deal that people are having the courage to, you know, make waves and create something. And, you know, I think it's just hitting, I think, hard for a lot of people, since synthesis is kind of like the gold standard in a sense for the retreat space. And, you know, some people are saying the training space as well. So to see something like a big organization like that kind of fold, you know, I think it, like you said with Field Trip, like maybe too early to some degree, right? Thinking about like, you know, I always like to remind folks, like, it feels like psychedelic therapy is here, but it's also not, right? And we have to remember that. And so, you know, it is going to be a complex landscape to navigate as this field develops.
Yeah, like psychedelic therapy is not here more than it's here, right?
Yeah.
Like ketamine is here, kind of. It's not really at scale. Cannabis-assisted psychotherapy hasn't really picked off yet, and yeah, we've got a bit of time before we're seeing psilocybin and MDMA in clinics. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There's a little quote here that kind of hit me a little bit as I was reading through this. And, you know, I really encourage everybody to go check out all these articles and kind of get like a nice in-depth perspective of what's going on here. But this is kind of more towards the closing, but Jules is saying, precisely because psychedelics are such an unstable regulatory market, perhaps one lesson is not to always make big bets too soon. And so, you know, thinking about the big bet with the ranch, Buckhorn Ranch, right? So like maybe getting ahead of what Oregon was actually going to allow in those counties. So he's saying, in poker terms, synthesis bet big before the flop and lost. Grow slowly, don't get inflated. I bet some of the fastest growing companies in the space don't exist in 5 years. And we've seen that, right? Like we've had different companies on throughout the years that have folded, right? They're not around anymore. And they threw a lot of capital into marketing and getting their stuff out there very quickly and being really flashy. And they didn't last too long. So I think it is a good reminder, right? Like there's this is a complex field to be in. And I think it's just a really good reminder.
And we just have to really be careful about who we're aligning with, how much we put in there. Are there red flags or not? I thought there was a really good phrase in there, like if management observes burnout and doesn't do anything to address it, that's a really big deal. Like we don't want burnt out employees. It's not good for culture. It's not good for anybody. So like figuring out radical ways to really address this is big. And a point that I think we've talked about on the show a lot and was mentioned in this article was how many sessions can somebody really run?
Yeah.
Like,
that was the other thing I really wanted to highlight that he pointed out. Just, facilitators saying that, people at big psychedelic companies are getting burnt out with facilitating, right? And this is tough work. And it takes a lot of resources to really provide, I think, a good space holding. And my supervisor always mentioned, even in psychotherapy, you're lending your heart out for an hour for somebody. And what type of toll does that have on you? And so thinking about lending your heart out for groups of people for a whole weekend and doing this really, really intense work, and I always come back to I think something Michael Harner said, shamanism's a part-time job. You and I
used to have problems with that too, right?
Yeah, because I'm I want to do breath work
not your full-time job.
I want to do this full time, but I think we also have to be real about your capacity, right? Of how much can you hold for somebody, especially in these very kind of vulnerable states where people are more expanded, more open, and dealing with a lot of traumas that are coming out. That's a lot to hold. And think about vicarious trauma that unfolds, just witnessing people's trauma. That takes a toll out on therapists. It takes a toll out on space holders. And so, we need to be addressing that if you are in that space holding facilitator role.
Yeah, it's something that we need to, as a scene, really analyze carefully. I've been thinking about how much, how regularly I would like to do breath work and facilitate a breath work retreat, and it's something every 3 months. It's certainly not monthly. Definitely not weekly.
Yeah, I'll tell you, running 6 retreats this year, all over the place with different types of formats and medicines. Mm-hmm. It was very rewarding, right? There is something that's energizing about it, but it's also a lot on the nervous system. And sometimes I come back and I just need a couple days off to not do anything. I really need to kind of digest and decompress just what happened there. Mm-hmm. And
so let's I guess another red flag, and we talked about this before, as soon as I found out they had purchased a $4 million farm is the figure I was told, but this article is saying 5, which I guess it makes sense. All legal fees, infrastructure improvements, etc. That could easily add up.
Permits and all that. Yeah.
I loved the idea, but I was immediately guys, the rules aren't written yet, and there's a lot of risk. Why? And it's this allure, and I think Field Trip similarly had this, the allure of first mover advantage. If you can be the first mover in business and survive, hell yeah, great. You've got a really good position. It's also a gamble. If you to your point earlier, are you too early? Is the market even there to support it yet? And I think a lot of retreat companies are seeing this. How much repeat business do you really get? Right? Unless it turns into a religious situation or a really, really, really deep connection to the community. Are you really going to go back to the same retreat center a few times a year or every other year even?
Yeah, I mean, some people, right? But it's also a pretty heavy expense for a lot of folks. People may be only able to afford that, if they're lucky, once a year, a couple times a year. I mean, there are folks that will go back to retreats over and over again throughout a year that have the financial capability to do so. But yeah, it's pretty expensive to run. And I can't imagine that there's actually a lot of profit there too. Right. Since, the amount of resources that goes into that.
Yeah, it's absolutely a tough business. I don't envy people that work in that field. Put it that way. I love the idea, and I understand why there's a certain level of romance there. It's just it's a hard few situations. I want to talk about something nice for a moment. Unless you have anything you want to throw in there, Kyle, about synthesis or Field Trip.
No, another article that I was looking at opb.org was kind of reviewing what happened there again, and kind of focusing more on Synthesis Digital collapse, so the training program. But it sounds like Retreat Guru has been trying to take that on, and it sounds like they're making progress. So they're saying that Retreat Guru said it's in contract talks to keep half of Synthesis staff and educators who were fired from the company on March 2nd. So it sounds like they're going to try to continue the education and deliver that to all the students that were in that training program, which I think in total was around 300, divided up again amongst like 4 different cohorts. So I'm just glad to hear that, hopefully that those students will, continue to get their education. I know some people probably aren't like super thrilled about Retreat Guru. Like in the article, they're like, who are they, right? Like they didn't have the name of Synthesis. And that's why some people were taking that program. But, glad to hear that maybe the students won't be left completely hanging and have lost everything.
Right. And, worst case scenario, hopefully we can help. And I think there's some other groups that might be able to help too. Yeah. So, hopefully it gets worked out. So there's a research study. Is this Oxford? Yeah, I think so. So, do you follow Eddie Talks Drugs on Twitter?
Sometimes, yeah. I haven't been on Twitter much, but yeah, every once in a while I'll pop in there.
Awesome. So his Twitter profile says psychedelic ethics, DPhil, so doctorate of philosophy student, Oxford Psychiatry, and WEH Oxford. What is that? I don't know. Not fancy enough to know what that is. WEH Oxford. Drugs policy, neuroethics, bit of Buddhism. Yeah. So there's a study going on. I'll just read his tweet. Have you participated in a clinical trial involving psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy? How has life been after the trial? Eddie would like to talk with you about your experiences. Contact psychedelic.experiences@psych.ox.ac.uk. We'll have a link here if you want to follow up with Eddie. It'll be in the show notes, or just Eddie Talks Drugs on Twitter. You can find it. There's a lot of things that can happen after a clinical trial, right? First off, we have to remember clinical trial is not therapy. Clinical trial is research. There's different levels of responsibility, apparently, in ethics around clinical trials versus therapy, right? There's finite money. You can't necessarily be in therapy for 3 years, right? Like they have to do a firm number of sessions. And a lot of people just aren't ready to be alone yet. Not to mention possible issues with their families, right? Like, your spouse or, your kids are just doing their lives and all of a sudden you're radically different. Like, it's got to be a little creepy, right?
Yeah.
Have you talked to anybody like post psychedelic session that's been really concerned about, like their family situation after?
Sometimes. Yeah. Whether or not their family accepts them or their family thinks that like what they did was unacceptable, weird, or it's changed them completely, and that like the family isn't on board with this new person. So I think that is like one of the biggest challenges, and that's why I always appreciate Dr. Della France's work talking about systems and how do you prep systems for change, and this being the family system, right? And so, we always kind of talk about this in different classes, but this is a big challenge for a lot of people, like coming back to their family, coming back to an environment that just like isn't nourishing and supporting of it, right? And what's worse than coming back feeling completely changed and healed, and then somebody's telling you like, you just took a drug, or, oh, that wasn't real, or like, oh, these insights, they seem crazy, or, they're kind of putting the experience down. And yeah, there's people that really experience that when they go back to a system. So, I think that is the tricky thing. How do you prep the systems. And what if that system isn't ready to hear some of the psychoeducation, right? So even when we worked with people with early episode psychosis, that's one thing that we really tried to do is prep the family systems, like give them a lot of psychoeducation, let people know, like, you know, what their son or daughter or partner is going through. How can we support them through that? Even though it might be challenging to our own belief systems, and what we think is best for somebody, right? So I think it's a huge challenge of this work, is when you have that deep, rapid change. You know, I think Dr. Jessica Katzman talked about this in the sense of like the therapeutic bends, like what happens when deep, rapid change happens too quickly, and using that scuba diving analogy. But yeah, how does it affect the system that you're in? Not everybody's always on board.
Right. And yeah, because some people are reliant on some of your malfunction sometimes, or deficiencies, and it's yeah, there's a lot there. From what I am told, there's some research coming of I think MAPS is even doing some of this couples therapy. So, you know, one person with PTSD and then their spouse, because they're observing that, yeah, like perhaps this is actually a really important thing to get them involved in the process as well. I think we're seeing it with, say, for example, somebody's dying. Maybe they don't need the psychedelic therapy. Maybe it's the family that needs it, so that they can be with them, help process grief, and be more present.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, you see this in regular therapy too, right? Somebody is doing their deep inner work, and then they're trying to change, and then the other person doesn't want that change to happen because that system is working, right? And then you depend on certain behaviors, certain habits, everything's wrapped up. So what happens when there is a change? It really causes a lot of destabilization for the most part. Sometimes, other times, if, the system wants to work and they know that, then hopefully they can get through it. But yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, right? Like, what if somebody else kind of needs to go through that to do some of their own work there?
Yeah. So, I'm hopeful. I think he, well, I don't want to speculate too much because I haven't chatted with Eddie about this, but there's a lot of insights to be gleaned afterwards as a third party when you observe the whole research landscape. Yeah, I love talking to trial participants. I learned so much.
Yeah.
Right. And we've chatted about this stuff plenty on the show in the past. So yeah, hit up Eddie if you've been in a clinical trial. And yeah, hopefully we can keep progressing the science and keep progressing how much we're helping folks, right? Yeah. Yeah, I guess a couple other things. There's one more article on boingboing.net. It's pretty much just citing OregonLive.com. Oregonians work to make psychiatric care a regulated and safe practice. This came out yesterday, March 14. Yeah, so it's quite interesting. It mostly is talking about Intertrek, and yeah, not too much depth there, but just wanted to point out Boing Boing is finally covering this stuff. I've been a fan of them for ages. And then Time magazine, time.com, had another article come out. Psychedelics could revolutionize couples therapy, which I feel like it's great to see in such a mainstream magazine. This came out on March 14, I think. Yeah. And it talks at first about, an unnamed person doing this in the black market. Then there's some citations from some of the Johns Hopkins team. Gives a little bit of the history. And, we have never really profiled Dr. George Greer, right? He did a lot of the initial MDMA work. And it would have been really good to, profile him at some point. Maybe we can do that once we have some time to do some historical courses or something. Yeah. But it was largely a really positive article, which I loved seeing. So something's going right in the media, in my opinion. Yeah. And I know he said we might not talk about it, but I just want to point it out. Headlines, both Psychedelic Spotlight and Marijuana Moment covered this move in Vermont. Both you and I have a lot of fondness for Vermont, Vermont legislators file 4 bills that would legalize psychedelics and decriminalize all drugs. Marijuana Moment headline: Vermont lawmakers file bills to legalize psychedelics and decriminalize all drugs. So, like, I think the agenda is going to be something like an Oregon, Colorado model, where licensed facilitators, that whole jam, like a nice tightly regulated model, probably going to be expensive again. But also on the larger drug policy side, I think they're going to try to mimic Portugal, where people, if they get caught with substances, personal use limits, they get a $50 fine, but that fine could be waived if you took a drug. What's the term? A screen by the government to say, do I have problems
for
or
substance use disorder?
Yeah,
which I thought was kind of interesting. That they would need to do that, but I mean, kind of cool that they would be decreasing it to a civil citation and a $50 fine. And I also thought it was interesting that the dispensing of any amounts of personal use would also be subject to a $50 fine. And so
if I got caught selling you like a couple mushrooms or a couple pills of some kind or another, that would also be, if it looked personal use, just a $50 fine.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this is Bill H423. And yeah, as Joe mentioned, there's about like 4 different bills out there. And then that bill would also seal criminal history records for past convictions for possession. That was of less than new personal use amounts. So that's cool to hear. And then another provision, and this is all on Marijuana Moment here, would establish a pilot program to allow people to test their drugs for purposes of determining the chemical composition of the substance and in identifying chemical contaminants. So that's pretty awesome that would allow that to happen, because just think about like all the deaths that have happened for not I mean, mainly with opioids, right? But it's nice to know what you're getting, and if you're taking anything, as we always say, if you can afford to ingest, you can afford to test. I think that's a dance safe slogan. And really important.
Yeah. So, I hope some of these things go through. Well, I would love for all of them to go through. But we'll see, right? Often the opposition to drug policy improvements are like, well, the more people that overdose, the better off we are because we have less drug users, right? It's like a really ugly thing, but a lot of them think it. Like I remember even a close friend, I've since changed his mind, saying stuff like, it's such a waste of taxpayer dollars. Why do we even use Narcan on them?
That's
right.
Yeah.
When an ambulance shows up, like, it's just nuts. It's nuts. And it's like safe supply, drug education. It's the same stuff we talk about all the time. So, like, how do we have a more nuanced and compassionate stance?
Yep.
Yeah.
But it sounds like some people aren't too, hopeful that these might pass, because Governor Phil Scott vetoed previous bills in the past. So I don't know. Hopefully he changes his mind about that. And then there are 2 other bills that we wanted to highlight too around this that were just introduced this month that would take some narrower approaches to decriminalization. So that's that. One of them is H439. That would strike psilocybin, mescaline, and peyote from Vermont's definitions of hallucinogenic drugs, effectively allowing the substances by removing them from state control. It's pretty interesting. And then the other one is S114, and that would remove only psilocybin from the state's definition of hallucinogens. And additionally, it would establish a state working group to study the substance's physical and mental health benefits to provide recommendations on establishing a therapeutic psilocybin program. Kind of interesting that they're taking like a multi-bill approach. And, hopefully that helps. So, I mean, we kind of saw this a tiny bit in New Jersey where, I mean, they didn't take a multi-bill approach, somebody snuck the bill, some clauses in around trying to decriminalize psilocybin, and they found it. It was in the well, there were two different cannabis bills. There was a decriminalization bill and then also a legalization bill, and I forget which one they snuck it in there. But they found it, and then they decided to separate it, and it did pass, but it was a different. They struck a different deal where instead of fully decriminalizing psilocybin, they knocked it down from a felony to a misdemeanor charge, and that's for an ounce of psilocybin. So, I don't know, maybe this multi kind of pronged approach, maybe they'll strike a deal somewhere and, have some sort of movement forward in drug policy.
Yeah. But it's nice to see, right? It's Vermont was a little slow on legalizing cannabis and implementing it. Like, I don't even know if there's recreational sales yet, right? Or are they?
They did, yeah. So
okay.
They legalized, I think, the year that I left. So I moved out of Vermont in 2016, and I think that's when they legalized, like right around that time. And then I think they just got sales going during the summer, because when I was up there during the summer, there was only like 2 or 3 places that opened. And I was there, I think, during the opening weekend or week that some recreational stores opened. So yeah, that's a long time. Took about close to 7 years, 6 years to implement retail. And I don't know, that is also kind of very Vermontish, to just kind of have this gifting economy. And I forget what the reason was. I was more kind of familiar with it, a number of years ago when I was really following it when I was living there. But yeah, kind of interesting that they took that approach and it took that long to get retail going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so stuff takes time. Vermont isn't the fastest, but I love that they're playing part in this whole agenda to get this stuff improved, implemented, etc. Yeah.
I mean, I think they're just kind of against corporate structures and corporate businesses. I mean, there's not too many Walmarts in the state, right?
Are there any?
So yeah, there are. But
for the longest time there wasn't. Which is
yeah.
fascinating to me. Yeah. So let's see, what else do we have?
There was
here?
another article at Psychiatric Times.
Let's jump into that.
When was this released? March 13th. So that was that was 2 days ago. So their headline reveals more than 50% of Americans misuse at-home ketamine. So All Points North released its Future Mental Health Ketamine Therapy Report, which examined opinions on and experiences with ketamine therapy, including at-home ketamine treatments. Researchers surveyed 2,000 adults and found that 64% of those taking ketamine said it helped with their symptoms. However, 55% of all of Americans and 58% of millennials who tried at-home ketamine therapy reported accidentally or purposefully using more than the recommended dose. Additionally, more than 1/4, so 26%, agree that they would rather use ketamine than antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications to treat their mental health symptoms. So really interesting. There was a little quote here saying this really should be done in conjunction with psychotherapy and with some sort of supervision. And I think to some degree that I think it is valid to maybe start off that way, right? But also could have this really saved people during the pandemic with some depression symptoms, right? Where they couldn't get into the office. And at least they possibly had this tool. Well,
let's go to rural populations too, right?
Right. Yeah.
And this is something that's happening at the DEA right now. There's, they're trying to push rules to limit what can be done via telemedicine. There's a New York Times article recently also substantially critical of at-home ketamine. Had a lot of really gnarly case studies. I didn't see them talk about very many. I didn't sense they wrote an equal number of positive stories, and they provided no figures. It's always some people do X. It's But, this psychiatry article, misuse, like, I'd want to dig into what do they actually mean by misuse, right? Like I have a prescription. I was supposed to do it with an NP and a therapist and all this stuff. Like how, like me doing it at home alone, like qualifies as misuse too, right?
Right.
So I've misused plenty of drugs by these definitions and terms, right? So
yeah, I'm guessing they're talking about like maybe like self-medicating and using it outside the scope of possibly treating, and then also taking more than the recommended dose, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Like there would be all these different categories, very medical, very clinical. Yeah, and the New York Times article even talked about people like melting their troches down and injecting, which is like pretty horrifying.
Wow.
I think injection's fine. I just think, you need to do it smartly with a safe supply, not like candy. It's like, throw some ketamine and Jolly Ranchers in a blender and inject it, right? It's like, not the best move. Yeah, so I don't know. I think rural populations alone are going to be impacted tremendously by this new DEA rule, where people actually have to see a physician physically to get prescriptions. Right. Like, it's going back to the way it was, kind of, right? But it still sucks. It's like excludes a lot of populations. Like how many doctors are willing to talk to you, or NPs are going to talk to you about your ketamine situation? Like,
I told my PCP that I was engaging in some ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and they were like, "Oh, I heard really great results about that." I was like, "Oh, wow, that's really fascinating." But I mean, it's a good point. Like when I started to kind of close down my practice, I didn't really have too many people to refer to out in this area. Everybody was out towards the city, and sometimes it's like an hour drive or so, and just thinking about like, where I'm at in New Jersey, like probably not too many people doing this around here, and I would need to go like drive an hour to go do that, and then thinking about how you need another person to go drive you, pick you up, and then do I know somebody that can take out like 3 hours of their day, or more to set that up? And so, I don't know. Yeah, the rural communities I think definitely get more hurt, and I think there could be like a good way to go about like making sure people are safe, right? And yeah, it's just that risk benefit analysis people really need to kind of do.
This mirrors some issues in other areas, like methadone clinics. People, you get out of jail, you can't live near your family, you need to spend all day on a bus to go get to your treatment and back, and then you're expected to somehow also, make life possible, like work and etc. It's like the system's designed in a lot of geographies to make these people like barely active citizens, right? It's like, okay, you're just locked into this framework forever.
Yeah, and ketamine aside, right? Like people that like in kind of more rural settings just have less services and like can't find adequate treatment. And yeah, it's just the system in general is just terrible for a lot of populations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and how can we identify these things and keep moving forward? Like another thing I wish we both read, but there was new guidelines that I think it was the FDA put out around opioid prescriptions, because there were so many people not able to get opioids based on physicians trying to handle the drug war via prohibition and like less prescriptions. Like obviously it didn't work, and in fact led to more addiction. But yeah, this it was painnewsnetwork.org. Headline: New CDC guideline, not FDA. New CDC guideline: too little, too late for chronic pain patients, March 14. But yeah, pretty much like talking about how physicians would be insulting. Like I have a friend who broke her back, literally broke her back, had required tons of surgery and became paralyzed for a long period of time. The physician said, "No, you're drug seeking. Get the hell out of here." Like very large lawsuit later, like, things did okay, but like it's inexcusable in my opinion to like refuse people treatment like that. without even doing an X-ray, right, to validate findings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a complicated ball of wax, right? It's like poor, people that are really struggling and can't get their medications.
Yeah, like physicians are just now, in the last couple of years, working on tapers. Like it was before cold turkey. All right, you're on these pills for 4 months. See you later, no more. Like obviously the black market and heroin are attainable things for them. So that was a major driver. Like it's just more drug war behavior, and drug war has never worked. Prohibition has never worked. And how do we lean towards compassion as opposed to lean towards control?
Right.
That's
right.
kind of where I'm at. Anyway, I think we got to wrap, but final thoughts on that one?
No, I was just thinking about the ketamine thing. Yeah, exactly. Like, can people deliver it in like a really mindful way where you're providing a lot of like education? I mean, doing some, possibly good screening there for people that need some sort of remote stuff. Like I knew somebody that was like really against kind of remote work, and they ended up having a remote session with a client, and they said, wow, that worked really well. Like I was actually really surprised because like they were in the safety of their own home and they felt comfortable and this and that. And so I think it's also the way some companies operate, right? And I wonder like, where were some of these people receiving treatment? What were like some of the companies prescribing? I've had some clients that transitioned from other companies, and they were getting prescribed pretty high doses, and like way beyond like what they would get prescribed if they were working with the prescriber that I was working with. So I think there's probably a lot of kind of variables there to the study as well that I would love to kind of see more in-depth details around that, which I'm guessing they probably didn't collect, right?
Yeah.
So,
all right. So let's wrap it. Thank you, Kyle. If people are interested in Vital, learning more, email us, info@psychedelicstoday.com. And what's the Vital website, Kyle?
vitalpsychedelictraining.com.
Great.
You can learn more there.
Yeah, it's been extraordinary to see the results and how happy people are with it. So, and we this will come out Friday, and Thursday you're actually running a premiere of the film that we've had developed with Ronan. So it's going to be really cool. So check that out as well on our YouTube channel. There will be a video available, 11-minute film we put together. It's really, really well done. I'm amazed at how beautiful it is. So check that out. All right.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you, everybody.
Until next time.
Thank you, Joe.
You got it. Thank you. Bye-bye.